Hey guys, and welcome back to another Mystery Monday video on my channel. Today's video is one that I actually talked about already in the past. I think it was the second video that I ever uploaded, but because it was the second video that I ever made, it wasn't very good and I didn't go into as much detail as I would have liked to, and I think that this topic is very interesting, so I thought that it was worth a revisit because most of you probably didn't see that video. But anyways, with that all being said, let's get right into today's case. So today we are going to be talking about the very strange case of Gloria Ramirez, also known as the Toxic Lady. Now, I don't really have too much back information on Gloria. I don't really know what her personality was like or what was going on in her personal life. There isn't really much of that I could find online. All I do know is that at this time she was 32 years old and sadly was suffering from cervical cancer. On February 19th, 1994, Gloria Ramirez was rushed into a Riverside General Hospital located in California. When she was rushed into the hospital, she was conscious, but she was in a wheelchair because she was really out of it. Now, when you go into the hospital to go to the emergency room, I'm sure that a lot of you guys have been through this, but they just ask you like routine questions just to make sure that you can answer them and whatever else. And while they were asking her these kind of like routine questions, she was answering very delayed, and when she did answer, her answers were quite short, very one-worded. Like you could just tell she was super out of it and not all there at that time. And shortly after talking to the nurse who was at the front of the hospital, Gloria actually passed out. Gloria had passed out, though the nurses did notice that she had very shallow breathing. Her heart rate was dropping very rapidly, like really significantly, like alarming. And her heartbeat was beating so fast that the nurses who were looking after Gloria at this time described it as out of control. And as you have probably guessed, this case is just going to get stranger because if it didn't, we wouldn't have a reason to talk about it on my channel. So obviously, now that Gloria was passed out and she was having all of these issues, it was clear that this was an emergency. So they rushed her right back into treatment, and this is when all of the doctors and nurses noticed immediately while they were working on Gloria that she had a very oily sheen covering her entire body. Now, something else that I should mention here is that even though Gloria was still passed out, they wanted to keep her sedated throughout the treatment. So they gave her diazepam and lorazepam to keep her sedated, just so that she wouldn't wake up while they were giving her treatment. And they also gave her Lidocaine and Bertillon to keep her heart rate down. Now, I hope that I'm pronouncing those medications correctly, but obviously I'm not a medical professional and I have no experience with these drugs, so there is a high chance that I did not pronounce the names right. At this time, the doctors and nurses who had come into contact with Gloria said that there was a very fruity, garlicky scent coming from her mouth. They said that it was unlike anything they had smelled before on a patient, and that the only way that they could describe this was as fruity and garlicky. One of the nurses who was working on Gloria at this time was named Susan Kane, and this time she was directed by the doctor to take Gloria's blood. And that is when she noticed that not only was Gloria's mouth giving off this strange scent, but when she took Gloria's blood, she said that she could smell it and that it smelled very chemically, and she described it as smelling similar to ammonia. After noticing this strange scent that was coming from Gloria's blood, Susan decided to pass her blood off to Dr. Gorginski just to look at it and make sure it was all right. And that is when Dr. Gorginski actually noticed that there was manila-covered particles floating around inside Gloria's blood, and she said that she had never seen anything like this before. Shortly after coming into contact with Gloria's blood, Susan actually started to complain about a burning sensation on her face, and shortly after this, she actually passed out and had to be rushed out of the room where Gloria was being treated. To make things even stranger, Dr. Gorginski, who had actually studied Gloria's blood, or who Susan had actually passed Gloria's blood onto, started to complain that she was feeling nauseated, and shortly after that, she also passed out. Another nurse came into the office, I guess, to kind of take over for Susan Kane, and after coming into contact with Gloria, she also passed out as well, and her name was Marie Walsh. Because of how bizarre and crazy this situation seemed, the hospital staff was really freaked out. So the entire hospital's ER was actually evacuated out into the hospital parking lot because they didn't want any of the other patients to come into contact with Gloria and fall ill or pass out or anything to escalate worse. So the entire ER and most of the nurses and doctors who were in the ER were also all evacuated out into the hospital's parking lot. A skeleton crew had stayed behind in the hospital working on Gloria and trying to revive her, but unfortunately this was to no avail, and Gloria Ramirez actually passed away on February 19th, 1994 at approximately 8:40 p.m. Would later confirm that Gloria Ramirez's cause of death was actually due to kidney failure. But now let's get back to talking about some of the other strange things that happened following Gloria showing up at the hospital. 25 people who had been in the hospital that night and had come into close contact with Gloria Ramirez had actually fallen ill after coming into contact with her. And 5 of these people were actually hospitalized after coming into contact with Gloria Ramirez. Dr. Gorginski, who had obviously come into very close contact with Gloria Ramirez, was actually in intensive care for 2 weeks following this incident. And while in intensive care, she actually developed hepatitis as well as vascular necrosis in both of her knees. When the California Health Department got wind of this strange incident, they actually sent down 2 of their very own scientists to kind of try and figure out what exactly happened that night, because I would imagine that this kind of thing does not happen every day. This is super rare and confusing, and not something that you would see every day while working in a hospital. The scientists who had been sent down to investigate this situation's names were Anna Osorio and Kristen Weller. Now, while these 2 scientists were working on the case, they did discover that anybody who had come within 2 feet of Gloria Ramirez that day did suffer from some kind of symptoms. Now, these symptoms were involuntary muscle spasms, shortness of breath, and obviously fainting or passing out. And that was actually, I think, the most common. More of the people who had come into contact with Gloria Ramirez that day did end up eventually passing out. And this brings me to my first theory in this case. These 2 scientists who were sent down from the California Health Department actually said that anybody who suffered from any kind of illness or any of these symptoms who came into contact with Gloria Ramirez were actually suffering from mass hysteria. Now, I don't want to discredit anybody or say that this is not possible at all. Obviously, this is possible. They're scientists, they're very well trained, and they probably know more about what I'm talking about right now than what I know about this topic. But I just personally don't think that this theory is likely. Now, the reason that I don't think this theory is likely is because this is a hospital. The people who were working on Gloria Ramirez are trained, you would think, to be able to handle situations like this where somebody may come in with an illness that maybe possibly at first you don't know what it is. And of course, I don't have any medical training again, but you would think that they would be trained to be able to handle these types of situations. I also think that if it was mass hysteria, Dr. Gorginski was in intensive care for 2 weeks following this incident. So could that be from a completely unrelated illness? And maybe they just caught it because of the mass hysteria? I'm not really sure, but I personally just don't think that mass hysteria is a likely one in this case. Although I could be wrong, and again, I don't want to discredit anybody because a lot of people do believe that that was the case within this case. We're going to talk about the second theory in this case. So Susan Cain and also Dr. Gorginski, who obviously fell very ill after coming into contact with Gloria Ramirez, do not believe the mass hysteria theory at all. So they took it upon themselves to hire their own personal group of scientists to try and see if they could get a better explanation for what had happened that night at the hospital. Now, this is where the next part of this case becomes very scientific. So please forgive me, as my pronunciation of a lot of these words is probably going to be incorrect, but I'm going to try my hardest, so please just bear with me through that. So the scientists that were hired by Dr. Gorginski as well as Susan Cain believe that it is likely that Gloria Ramirez was taking a drug called dimethylene sulfoxide. This drug is often used to decrease the feeling of pain. So they think that it is likely that Gloria could have been taking this drug to decrease the pain of her cancer, as well as decrease the pain that she was probably feeling after her kidneys started to fail. Now, this drug is actually known to have a garlicky scent, and due to the urinary blockage that would have been going on in Gloria's body due to the fact that her kidneys had failed, it is likely that this scent could have been protruding out of her mouth. It is also likely that when Gloria was given oxygen, it would have actually changed this drug into a completely different compound. So the dimethylene sulfoxide would have turned into a compound called dimethylene sulfone. Now, that would again explain the garlicky scent that was coming out of Gloria's mouth, but it would also explain the manila-colored particles that were floating around in her blood, because this compound is known to crystallize at room temperature. That also wouldn't be the only thing that kind of explains the rest of this case, but because Gloria at this time was going into cardiac arrest, she would have been treated with defibrillators. Now, it is said that when the defibrillators were provided to Gloria Ramirez, it is very, very likely that the compound changed yet again from dimethylene sulfone to dimethylene sulfate. So this compound had actually changed 3 times while it was within Gloria's body. And this chemical is actually known to produce a toxic gas. And scientists and chemists who have really studied this case say that all of the symptoms that the doctors and nurses experienced after coming into contact with Gloria Ramirez that night are very, very similar to the symptoms that you would experience while ingesting this toxic gas. But there is actually only 2 problems with this theory. One is that Gloria Ramirez's family strongly stand by the fact that they do not believe that Gloria was taking any kind of drug. They don't think that she would, as a person, take any kind of drug that was not provided to her by her doctor. So they strongly disagree with this theory. Another thing that kind of shakes this theory up a little bit is that a lot of scientists really do stand behind this and say that they strongly believe that this is the explanation for what happened on that day. But others say that it is absolutely impossible for these chemicals to have changed so dramatically inside of the human body. And that brings us to theory number 3. Now, some people say that Riverside is actually America's meth capital, and at least it was at the time that this incident had taken place. So some people believe that because the meth production in that area was so strong at this time, that they were actually moving around where the meth would be produced just to kind of avoid it being detected and avoid getting caught. So again, this is just a theory. I am not saying this is true at all. I have no idea what was going on at this time. I don't think anybody else who was not involved in this case really has any idea of what was going on at this time. So I just want to make it very, very clear that this is just a theory. But anyways, this theory goes that some of the hospital employees were actually producing meth precursors within the hospital to help the different production station kind of thing that was going on at this time. People have speculated that it is possible that the meth had been stored in IV bags in order to smuggle them out of the hospital without detection, and that somehow one of these bags actually got messed up and it ended up being connected to Gloria Ramirez on the day of February 19th, 1994. It is said that the government knows about this, and they actually ended up covering this up after they found out what was going on, because they didn't want the hospital to be shut down. And that is why the government sent scientists actually stated that this was mass hysteria instead of something much larger like a failed meth operation. Now, I do have problems with this theory. I could be wrong again, but I don't think that Gloria ingesting meth would have caused an oily sheen all over her body. I don't think that it explains the garlicky, fruity scent coming from her mouth. It doesn't explain the manila-colored particles that were found floating in her blood. And it also doesn't explain why all of the people who came into contact with her fell ill. Now, that could just be me. I obviously don't have any experience in meth manufacturing or meth use or anything like that, so I could be completely wrong, but to me, that just seems like a very, very problematic theory. The last theory in this case that I'm just going to brush the surface of really briefly is that aliens were somehow involved in this case. Now, you guys know me, and you know that I'm super, super open to aliens. I do believe they exist, and I do believe that some of the cases that I've talked about on this channel do have some kind of alien involvement, but in this particular case, I'm just not convinced. There is too many other things that could have explained what had happened that day in the hospital. So personally, I just don't think that aliens are a likely theory in this case. But if you have another reason why you believe that aliens could have been involved in this case, please leave that down below, because I always love to hear you guys' theories on that, especially when they involve things like aliens and whatnot. Since this case has taken place, it actually inspired many doctor type TV shows, and there's actually an episode of X-Files that is based on this case. 2 months after Gloria's death, her body was actually returned to the family, and sadly, due to their lack of funds, they actually had to hold 2 garage sales to fund her funeral. And now Gloria Ramirez's body remains in Oliver Wood Cemetery in an unmarked grave. My heart sincerely goes out to the family of Gloria Ramirez and anybody else who was affected by this case. It is absolutely heartbreaking, and it's so confusing and sad, and I just can't believe that something like this could happen, and her family is pretty much left with no answers. There's a lot of like maybes, but there is no real answers in this case, and it almost leaves you with more questions than what you had going into it. It's just absolutely mind-boggling that something like this can happen. But guys, that brings us to the end of this video. I do just quickly want to apologize because my house has been excessively loud throughout filming this video. This is the only time that I have to film this video, and my sister came over for a visit and she has the loudest voice of anybody on the planet. But anyways, if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!